Gaming reviews done quick. Not even Hermes could catch up. Welcome to the 1 Minute Rundown. I'm Octrinity, your host, and not even the Sisters of Fate can hold me back from these reviews. This time we're running down God of War. Since its inception in 2005, this series very quickly became a favorite in the world of 3D action games. It's set in ancient Greece and frequently features people, places, and monsters in Greek mythology, but it centers around Kratos, a Spartan warrior with a tortured past and a score to settle. Kratos' preferred weapons are the Blades of Chaos, a sort of chain-sword combination with some grappling ability, but he's adept at using several other weapons and magic, most of which can be powered up using new skills and strength through an experience system. In spite of being an action game, a lot of puzzle and platforming elements frequently show up as well, along with quick-time events as a result of certain cutscenes or finishing moves. Oh yeah, and it's a bit... how can I put this delicately? Unnecessarily gory. There are 6 games in this series. Come join me in checking out their history. I don't think it'll take too long to see how this game works. You fight hordes of minions, occasionally you get a platforming or puzzle segment, and every 30 or 40 minutes you'll get a storyline segment that explains how we got here, which incidentally isn't that far removed from how the rest of the series went. And this one does a great job of pacing everything, at least until around the halfway point. You'll move from location to location at a fairly brisk pace, learning new skills along the way, but this progress seems significantly slower once you reach the Rings of Pandora, where almost the entire second half of the game takes place. There also seems to be some significant gameplay unbalance, where you're more likely to die from puzzles than combat, and Rage of the Gods, the game's occasional power form, feels like it's pretty much an instant win button on anything that's not a boss. But really, unless we're going to compare against the rest of the series, that's about all I've got for bad stuff. Sure, the sequels have improved on the formula some, but in the end, none of this really holds the game back that much from being exactly what it wants to be: a good, solid, and most importantly, enjoyable action game. God of War 2 is one of those sequels that knows it's already in good shape and just needs some minor refinements and enough different from the first game to stand out. In fact, I'd say it does a pretty excellent job of easing you into that by starting you off with most of the high-level skills you had in the first game before the storyline finds reason to strip these powers away and acquire a different skill set. And when it doesn't outright change, it mostly just improves on. About the only things that don't change are the Blades of Chaos have pretty much the same skills available. The environments seem a lot more varied than the previous games, Rage of the Titans feels more balanced, the story feels like it incorporates more of its source material, the puzzle segments are a lot more varied, and there's a pretty cool artifact you get early on with some time twisting ability, though it's mostly used for puzzles. It doesn't quite get everything right though, as there are still some weapons and abilities that feel totally useless, but again, not a deal breaker in the slightest, and definitely an improvement over the first game. As an interesting bit of trivia, this game actually came out after the PS3, showing that next gen is not a necessity. If God of War 2 is a step in the right direction for the series, this is closer to a step right back to, or perhaps in the same direction of where they just were. It's not that this is a bad game, and it's still a good recommendation for someone with a PSP but not a system that can play the other games in the series. The problem here is that it does absolutely nothing to set it aside from the last 2 games. Even the weapons and magic and most of the enemies feel like they're just ripped off from the first game, and some features like Rage of the Whatevers are removed without replacement. I know the common defense here is that it's for a handheld system not as powerful as the PS2, but I've already reviewed games like Zero Mission and Link's Awakening that show that's a terrible excuse. And while none of these games have a particularly deep stories, I can't help but feel they didn't quite know where they wanted to go with this game's. Really, it's just too much of a rehash of the last 2 games, and both of those are better. So all you're left with here is a game that's pretty good on its own, but if you've played those 2 already, you won't find much of interest here. I have a feeling this game will be most enjoyed by the people who played the first 2 games, as it's the final game in the story that begins mere minutes after God of War 2 left off, and ends with, to avoid any spoilers, one of the best series finales I've seen. But that's not to say it won't be enjoyed by everyone else too. The big change in terms of gameplay is that each weapon is tied to a specific magic spell, but this time they took care to make sure all of the weapons and spells are actually useful, even if you'll tend to gravitate towards some more than others. Kratos gets a non-magical weapon gauge too, used for side items like a bow and arrow and other artifacts of the gods. But everything else just seems expanded on, including a few things that previously didn't even feel like they needed much fixing, like the climbing abilities. Some of the larger enemies can be temporarily mounted and controlled. The game feels a little more boss-oriented than the previous games, but each boss encounter feels completely different and keeps a high adrenaline experience going the whole way. Honestly, this game kept things going so well, it's one that I pulled an unnecessary all-nighter just to finish. Simply put, play this game. While likely using Chains of Olympus as a base, this game seemed to learn from its mistakes and opted not to reuse so many previous ideas and came up with a skill set that feels a lot more original. Rage of the Somethings is different again, this time regenerating over time, somewhat similar to the items from the previous game. The game's obligatory side weapon is a javelin and shield combination and probably serves as one of the more interesting side weapons, as well as one you'll see consistent use of throughout the game. The storyline's also more interesting. It's more of a side story, but takes you through trying to find out what really happened to Kratos' brother Deimos. But let's be real here. It's still a God of War game, it's still running off the same engine, using a lot of the same basic moves, and thus still pretty similar to the ones before. You pretty much know what you're getting right off the bat, and as previous reviews show, the formula isn't exactly broken, they're just changing enough to keep it different. It should go without saying that if the other games didn't do much for you, this probably won't either, but otherwise you're getting a fully fledged entry in the series that's worth playing. This is to date the newest game and supposedly the origin story of the series, and honestly I had a hard time enjoying this one as much. One thing I did really like is that you can find other weapons to use as a secondary weapon, many of which can be pretty useful. Kratos can switch between 4 different elemental powers, each of which have the same basic moves but different special skills, and using those special skills causes enemies to drop different types of orbs, which sounds cool and all, but they feel way too similar to each other, and the skills that make them more unique don't get unlocked until way too late into the game. These ideas also drive the feature they're advertising most here, a competitive multiplayer mode, and that lost its appeal pretty quickly as it feels way too button mashy. The usual rage meter is swapped out for another concept where Kratos can use more powerful skills if he lands lots of hits without getting hit himself, but these new skills are frequently the same ones he had by default in the other games, so the end result is their basic moveset feels way too limited, and frequently the camera seems to zoom out way too far as if the game's forgotten it's not a movie. But all I'm left with here is the core God of War experience, and that's certainly not broken, but you can do better than this. Now, with a game as needlessly gory as this one, this seems like a good place to talk about that one gaming issue non-gamers seem to never understand: violence and other objectionable content in games. I mean, since video games have become popular, we've always had moral guardians in our face about how playing violent video games would make the players violent too. And to be fair, it's not a huge stretch. I mean, if Guitar Hero inspired or helped people learn to play guitar, who's to say this won't do the same with fighting? On the other hand, it's not like any of these would create talent for these on their own, because we all know a game like this wouldn't teach you how to actually fight or be violent just the same way someone who plays lots of Madden won't suddenly become a professional quarterback without lots of real-life training. Now sure, there have been some people who have taken these to their logical extreme and ruined it for the rest of us, and don't get me wrong, that is terrible and tragic, but let's look at the other end of things. How many people have played games like that and turned out totally fine? I don't think statistics exist for that beyond asking people I already know, but I think the graph of that would be pretty lopsided. Now, I know there is someone out there going to be like, won't someone think of the children? And my response to that is, this game isn't meant for children. It says so on the box. There's a content rating system out there, one that if anything is more conservative than necessary, and they've existed since the early 90s as a response to what was then the most needlessly violent game out there, Mortal Kombat. And last I checked, game retailers were really good about enforcing it, and I probably wouldn't let my as-of-now theoretical children play a game like this until I felt they were old enough to understand what they saw either. But hey, that method of thought has proven to work for pretty much every other medium of fiction, and very few people complain about those either because, simply put, they work. Really, the whole system doesn't need policing, at least no more than there already is. Just be responsible about it. And with that, this review is history. For those keeping track, there's also a lesser-known 7th game in the series, Betrayal, which is only available on cell phones. If you're interested in checking out any of these games, they've all got greatest hits status, so they're common in the used game market. But they've also been in multiple collections. God of War 1 and 2 are on one collection, both PSP games are on another, and a third collection is both of those previous collections combined, plus God of War 3. And for those of you who appreciate a good storyline, here is the in-universe chronology, not that it's needed to enjoy the games. If you've already played these and are looking for some similar games, a handful of others you might also like include Dante's Inferno, El Shaddai, the 3D Castlevania games, and the Devil May Cry series, which I already reviewed previously. Check back in a few weeks for the next episode of 1 Minute Rundown featuring another game heavily based on legend. Sort of. Until then...
What treachery is this?
Kratos, you're the guest star? Well, didn't expect that, Come on in, say a few words if you want. Tell the guys what you thought of...
You dare speak poorly of my god-slaying adventure!
Look, I'm sorry, Kratos, but really, they were kind of average game... Why are you looking at me like that? Oh crap, no, don't... Ah!